Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and you are almost finished learning Bava Metzia. Mazel tov, b'shah tova. Very exciting. So, because we're almost finished learning Bava Metzia, I thought we might spend some time thinking about a topic that weaves in and out throughout Bava Metzia. It was in the Lamids, it was in the Samachs, it was in the Pays, and now it's in the Kofyuds, which is Mashkon, collateral. The collateral that is given from a lova to a malva, from a borrower to a lender. Now, this collateral, there's a lot of things you could say about it, right? You could have a lot of conversations about, oh, mashkon, is it really something that it's a payment for the loan, or is it something that is just a reminder or creates some sort of commitment that the lova is going to pay? And I think it's a fascinating discussion. You could have a conversation about the relationship between mashkon and ribit, mashkon and the possibility of taking uh, interest, right? Like what happens if you take a mashkon that actually pays profits to you? That would be kind of problematic. It turn into ribit, also interesting. But because you're finishing up Bava Metzia, and because mashkon show up so many places in Bava Metzia, I thought it might be nice to take one angle of what mashkon reflects about halakha in general, about loans in general, and that is that the Chumash and Chazal, to a great extent, see halvaot as stuck, see lending loans as stuck. The description of halva in the Torah is very stuck oriented, and mashkon is actually a big part of that. And I think one of the major ways you see that is that the orientation of the Torah towards mashkon is a limiting orientation. It's not an orientation of when you lend money, you should take collateral so you make sure someone pays back. It's actually when and if you take collateral, here are the limitations on what you're allowed to take, how you're allowed to take it, and how long you're allowed to keep it for. And by the way, whether you're allowed to take it. And I think that's really fascinating. So I want to spend some time just sort of rounding out the big picture, both in the Chumash and in Bava Metzia on that score, because I think it's very inspiring in the sense that things that we think about as business, the Torah sometimes might suggest is a form of chesed, right? And I do wonder how much, depending on what kind of loan we're talking about today, how much that chesed orientation actually factors in, right? Where are those places where that sense is still alive? And then where are those places where, no, 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 we're talking about kind of a cold business transaction, right? So let's take a look. The two places in the Torah that we're going to look at are Shemot Kaf Bet, Shemot 22, and Devarim Kaf Daled, Devarim 24. So Shemot Kaf Bet, we start with some pretty personal language on God's part. Im kesef talvet ami, if you lend money to my nation, right? Very personal for God. Et ani imach, the poor person who's with you. Lo tia lo kinoshe, you should not act like a creditor towards them. Lo tisimun alav neshach, for example, don't take interest from them, right? So of course, Chazal are going to have a machloket whether im kesef talvet ami means if you lend money to a fellow Jew, or when you lend money to a fellow Jew, within itself is suggesting perhaps the when you don't have a choice about it. It's a mitzvah. You have to do it, similar to tzedakah. But either way, it's clear we're talking about someone poor here. We're talking about a fellow member of the Jewish people. We're being told you should not treat them like this is a regular business transaction. You should not be taking interest trying to make a profit. Moreover, not only should you not make a profit, if you take a piece of clothing from them, you have to return it before sunset, because that's their only clothes. Hisim latol oro, it's what covers their skin. Bameshka, what are they going to sleep in? Bayaki zakelayin, when they call out to me, God says, Vishamati ki chanunni, I'm going to heed their cry because I am compassionate, right? This whole thing sort of is dripping with compassion and care and uh, quite frankly, a kind of non-business approach. It's also interesting that the ani, the poor person, is kind of at the center of it. Okay. When you get to Dvarim Kaf Daled, we seem to have a little bit more of an expansive perspective. We may not only be talking about the ani, um, and we do see other kinds of limitations. Okay. So, for example, Dvarim Kaf Daled Vav, Lo Yachvo Rechaim Barechem, you should not be taking grinding materials as collateral, because that's really taking somebody's life, right? You're taking the stuff that they need in order to make their ochel nefesh, in order to make the food that they're going to live on. I would imagine also if they're a farmer, also what they use to make a living. And the point is here, it doesn't say that anybody's poor, but it does nonetheless exact a limitation on what kind of mashkon you can take. A few psukim later in Pasuk Yud, it continues with what seems to be a general lender. It doesn't, a general borrower, excuse me. It doesn't seem to say anything about a poor person. Ki tashev re'acha mashat me'uma. If you are loaning any money to someone else, lo tavo el beito, lavot avoto. You should not be going into their house to take the collateral, right? Here, by the way, it's interesting, as distinct from Shemot 22, where it says, Lo tiat lo kinoshe, you should not be like a creditor if you're giving a loan to an ani. Here it says ki tashev recha, if you are acting like a creditor to someone, and maybe that's because they're not described as an ani here, right? So maybe there is a little bit more of a business transaction element, and nonetheless, we're being told you cannot go into their house to take that collateral. Why can't you go into their house to take that collateral? Probably a lot of reasons, right? Um, but maybe we'll talk about that when we get more to Chazal. Instead, b'chutz ta'amod, you got to stand outside. Va'ish asher tanu shebo, and the person who you're lending the money to, yotzi elecha et avodah chutza. The um they will bring the collateral out to you. Okay. And then we move from the general borrower to the ani. V'im ish anihu. And if the person is poor, lo tishkav bavoto, you should not sleep with their collateral. Hashev tashiv lo et avot shemesh. Again, you must return it to them at evening time. V'shachav v'salmato, and you'll be able to sleep with its garment. Uvercheka, and he'll bless you. Ulachati et tzedakah, and it considered righteousness for you, before God, right? You get this sense of, right? So maybe, if I want to soften it a little bit, when it comes to, like, if I want to soften the thesis a little bit, when it comes to an ani, alone is tzedakah. And when it comes to a non-ani, there's still limitations, important limitations, like not invading their personal private space to get their mashkon from them, like not taking a mashkon that is actually essential to their living, right? So maybe we see this in stages. But then a few psukim later, in Pasuk 17, Pasuk Yud Zayin, we add a new category, which is the almana, the widow. Lo tateh mishpat ger yatom v'lo tachvol beged almana. We should not be subverting the rights of the stranger or the orphan, and you should not be taking a widow's garment as collateral, right? So now it's not just, give it back at night. It's you don't take it at all. So we've seen sort of the most severe limitation. And you can imagine that you might think of an almanah in that time period, of a widow in that time period, as somebody who is like a permanent ani, right? It's not just an ani, somebody who's going through a cycle of poverty, a period of poverty, but this is a person who's defined as vulnerable within the economic system in an ongoing way, right? You could also imagine, as the Gemara is going to say, we don't really love the idea of you going to an almana's house every night to give her collateral back. Doesn't really look very good, right? But nonetheless, you see that this sense of concern for the vulnerable, the economically vulnerable in a kind of permanent way, whether, by the way, it's the ger and the yatom when it comes to just subverting justice generally, or the almanah when it comes to collateral. The next pasuk really sums it up, right? You have to remember that you were slaves in Egypt. You know what it means to be vulnerable, right? God took you out. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this thing, right? You have to be careful with the ani, the ger, the yatom, the almanah. I would even say, even with a regular borrower, you have to be a little bit careful. But what you see is really the thrust in the Chumash is limitation on the rights of the Malveh, whether it's a limitation of what you're allowed to take, don't take their livelihood, whether it's a limitation on who you're allowed to take from, don't take from an almanah, whether it's a limitation on how long you can keep it, no, you have to give it back every night, whether it's a limitation on standing outside a chutz tamod, you have to wait outside, right? So it's pretty actually remarkable, to be honest. It's pretty remarkable from an ethical standpoint, what we're looking at here. Now, when you get to Chazal, they add some layers that I think are very powerful. So one layer that I think is very powerful is the role of the Shaliach Beitin, the role of the emissary of Beitin. Now, you saw on Kuf Yud Gimel, Amud Aleph, you saw a Mishnah that said that lo yimashkenu ela b'beitin, right? You can't take a mashkon without the involvement of Beitin. And the emissary of Beitin, the Shaliach Beitin, becomes very important, right? Becomes very, very important. And so the Gemara says, even though that Shaliach Beitin is very important, and you might say, as the Sefer Chinuch does, which I put it on the sheet if anybody wants to look at it later, that the role of that Shaliach Beitin is to make sure that justice is served, right? The little guy doesn't get messed over by the big guy. But even the Shaliach Beitin, the Gemara says, is not allowed to go into the woman's house to collect the collateral, right? That it's like another level of maintaining the dignity of the lova and maybe even maintaining the choice of the lova to choose what mashkon they want to give, right? So the Gemara Bava Metzia tells on the bottom of Kafut Gimel Amud Aleph up to Kafut Gimel Amud Bet, saying Mimashma Shneimar b'chutz tamod, when the pasuk says you have to wait outside. Don't I know that it means that the person who you are lending to is going to bring the collateral outside? Ella matalmud lomar. So why does it say v'ha'ish? And the person will bring it out. L'rabot shaliach beitin. That's to add the role of the emissary of the court. But the Gemara says, wait, do you mean the shaliach beitin, my love? Doesn't it mean shaliach beitin kilova, meaning the shaliach beitin is just like the borrower in the sense that the shaliach beitin can also go into the house and get the collateral? And the Gemara says, lo, 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 no. Shaliach beitin kimalva. Now, the shaliach beitin acts in the place of the lender and is like the lender, may not go into the house either, right? And then the Gemara goes on, it says a little bit more and then proves it from different psukim, also using some psukim from Shmo Kafbet. But it's really interesting to suggest that on the one hand, you see that it seems to be like, oh, you would think it's enough to have just a shaliach beitin who's the middle person. So let the shaliach beitin go in and collect. Nope. Even the shaliach beitin is not allowed to go in and collect. Now, I might say not everybody agrees with that. It's actually interesting. There's Yerushalmi that talks about the possibility of the shaliach beitin would go in and collect something that's better than what the lova would have wanted to give, but not as nice as what the malva would have wanted to take, right? So in that way, the shaliach beitin is playing a mediating role, and you have that Yerushalmi here as well on the source sheet. But regardless, that shaliach beitin, that putting an emissary of beitin in between those two people and still limiting that shaliach beit din, I think is really significant. There's another aspect that the Gemara adds and discusses besides for the shaliach beit din that I think is also, significant to think about. And that is the ownership and thus the responsibility that the malveh has over the mashkon. Okay? The words ulachati tzedakah, it's going to be considered righteousness for you to return that mashkon every night. Chazal turn it into something else. And let's take a look. And I think it's quite powerful. 1 second. And this is if you can remember back to Bava Metzia Pei Bet Amud Aleph, right? So it goes like this. Sorry. Now we're in the midst of everything, but suffice to say the Gemara is talking about the question of who is responsible if the mashkon gets lost, right? So Gemara says, well, to Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says, Minayin leval chov shekone mashkon. How do we know that the lender acquires the mashkon? Meaning, if the mashkon gets lost, even if it's nobody's fault, it's the mashkon's financial responsibility. Shneimar, as it says, ulachati tzedakah, it will be righteousness for you, or the way the Gemara is reading it is, it'll be tzedakah for you. It is charity for you to return this salma or this simla, the beged, every night, the mashkon every night. In eno kone mashkon, if the malveh does not own, has not acquired the mashkon, tzedakah minale. Why would we call it tzedakah? Right? Again, it's reading it not as righteousness, but as charity. Mikan the Baal Chov shekone mashkon. This teaches us that the Baal Chov, that the lender, is the one who owns the mashkon. Now it's more complicated than that, and in the end, generally paskin from what I was able to glean, that we consider the malveh a shomer sachar, right? Which means that if the thing is stolen or if it's lost, then the malveh is responsible. But if it's a case of onus, then the malveh is not responsible. But nonetheless, I think it's a powerful, I think this is a powerful discussion of what's the accountability, right? What's the accountability? There's a third aspect besides for the shaliach beit din, besides for the idea that the malveh is actually financially responsible to a great degree, if not fully, for the mashkon. And that is the Gemara Bava Metzia Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, which talks about the fact that, whether you took the mashkon the right way, meaning using beit din, or you took the mashkon the wrong way, you still have to return the mashkon every night, right? You still have to give that back. Now, of course, you might say to yourself, somebody who's taking a mashkon the wrong way, why would they want to give it back? Why would they do the right thing? I'm not sure, right? It's a fair question. You might say, oh, we're giving you an opportunity, right? Like you can, right? Something like that. But I do think it's basically trying to say you're on the hook for these limitations. Even if you broke one of them, you still have to keep the other ones, right? So the Gemara learns it on Lamed Aleph Amud Bet from Hashev Tashiv. You definitely have to return, right? Mikol makom, no matter what, whether you took it with the sanction of the court or you didn't take it with the sanction of the court. Right? So I would say those three elements of Hashev Tashiv, you have to make sure that you return it, of the role of the Shaliach Beit Din as like an addition to Bachutz Ta'amod, and the Kinyan, the ownership, the acquisition, and financial responsibility that a malveh has over this Mashkon, I think all indicates that what we're talking about here is something that isn't just sort of a cold financial transaction, I would say, right? Even as we note that some of these limitations are varied based on, are we talking about a regular lovet? Are we talking about a lovet who's an ani? Are we talking about a lovet who is an almana, right? So with that, I actually want to end, and it's so funny because I think that in some ways this is such a fitting ending to Bava Metzia in general. I want to end with a Midrash Tanaim that asks the question of why does this section in Devarim Kaf Daled end with, V'zacharta ki eved hayita, right? Like you got to remember that you were an Eved. And the reason why I'll tell you in a minute why I think it's a fitting ending to Bava Metzia, even as, next week, God willing, at the Siyum, we'll ending to Bava Metzia. But it goes like this. Let me share my screen for those who are following. Although I'm starting to get the sense that people listen more than they watch these. But let's see. So the Midrash Tanaim, V'zacharta ki eved hayita b'Mitzrayim. V'chima inyan eretz Mitzrayim. What does this have to do with eretz Mitzrayim? Shelo tomar. You shouldn't say hareini mimashkein beged almana b'seiter. You know what? I'm going to secretly take a mashkon. V'chimi modia begaloi. Who's going to say anything publicly? Nobody's going to say anything. So Amar Hamakom, so God says, Je'u ma'asiti b'mitzrim or b'mitzrayim. See what I did to Egypt or with the Egyptians. Shayu ma'asehen b'seiter, who did things secretly. Now, I don't know what secret things we're referring to, right? But upir samtim begalui. And God says, I made them infamous for it. I publicized the bad things that they did, right? Meaning, Ma'inyan Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai, Ma'inyan Mitzrayim Eitzel Beged Almana for a Mashkon. The same way you might find yourself tempted to do things that are ethically prohibited by the Torah in private because you can get away with them. You should just know people have tried that before. And God is going to make sure you're found out. And then to end on a positive, bahalo hadvarim kal v'chomer. Maybe it's an a fortiori. If this is true, then how much more so is that true? Ma imidata puranut shehi meuta ha'oseh b'seder hamakom mefarsamo begalui. Sorry. How? And it's a weird kal v'chomer, right? And I'm reading it the way that I'm reading. I don't know if anybody would agree with me, but if the midah of punishment, which is only a little, someone who does things in private, God publicizes it in public. Kal v'chomer, how much more so would God publicize the midat hatov, which is so vast? Now, I don't know if it's saying there is not a lot of bad and God doesn't want to publicize it, even if it's there, but God does. How much more so would God want to publicize the good? Not totally clear to me what this, midat hapuranut being mi'uta a little, but midat hatov that is mirba a lot. But I think I'm comfortable saying that if God's going to be mefarsim the bad, kal v'chomer, God's going to want to be mefarsim the good, right? And the reason why I think this is a very fitting ending to Bava Metzia is because I think while on the one hand, Bava Metzia is talking about how a society functions, and these things are pretty public, actually, right? These are like civic laws and regulations and concerns. On the other hand, there's a lot in the world of financial life that happens in private that people can get away with, that other people don't see and that aren't overseen. And I just take it as a given that Chazal are dedicating their discussions in Bava Metzia to aspirationalism, right? Because they don't have a means of enforcement in the same kind of way. But the idea is that people should want both Bigalui in public and Baseter in private to be doing the right thing and not just to be asking themselves how they can profit. Mazel tov on your upcoming shiur. See you soon.